The Conference on World Drug Policy Directions after UNGASS 2016 and reviews on Thai drug laws and their interpretation at Centara Grand at Central Ladprao on the 15th to the 16th of June 2016. Please give a big round of applause to Ann Fordham. Ann Fordham, a Thai descendant, is the Executive Director of International Drug Policy Consortium, or IDPC, leading on international advocacy efforts on drug policy and human rights. She received a master's degree in human rights from the University of Sussex, England. Ms Fordham specializes in human rights and harm reduction. She represents IDPC at international events and works with policymakers and civil society partners around the world to review and shape drug control policies towards more humane, effective approaches that are based in principles of human rights and public health. Her previous role was at the International HIV/AIDS Alliance, where she was engaged in policy work around prevention, treatment and care for people who use drugs. Besides, her roles and endeavours include Harm Reduction Advocate, supporting the work of Harm Reduction Australia, member of the Strategic Advisory Group to UN on HIV and injecting drug use, and keynote speaker in several public discussions and events. Ms Fordham wrote several editorials in publications around the world, including the Huffington Post and the Bangkok Post.
So thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. It really is a privilege and an honor, so thank you very much to the Kamlang Jai project and also to the Ministry of Justice for the kind invitation. I really have come directly from London this morning. I just landed at 10 o'clock this morning and I've come straight here to give you this presentation. So, yes, just very briefly, sorry, I don't know how to move the slides. Oh, sorry. So just very briefly to introduce the International Drug Policy Consortium, the IDPC, of which I'm the Executive Director and the Coordinator. We're a global network of over 150 organizations from over 60 countries. And I'm happy to say that our network in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular continues to grow. And we have a small office here in Bangkok with my colleague, Ms. Gloria Lay, who's here in the audience, who focuses on our Asia regional program supporting our members in the region. So IDPC members come together to promote objective and open debate in drug control policies. Our mandate is twofold. One is to ensure that the voice of civil society representatives and organizations are heard in drug policy making forums, whether that's at the national level, say here in Thailand, or the regional level in the forums around ASEAN, or at the international level at the UN. And we also seek to influence those policy debates through providing policy analysis and advice directly to government policymakers. As a network, we advocate for the reform of drug policies so that they are grounded in the principles of human rights, of public health, of development, and human security. These are the broader objectives of the United Nations. And so I'm going to be talking about the UNGASS, the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs that took place in April. I have a particular expertise and view to talk about the UNGASS because personally I have been working towards the UNGASS since it was announced in 2012. And as IDPC as a network also has been very focused on trying to influence the UNGASS outcomes. So I really have to also admit something here because The UNGASS just happened in April. I know that seems 2 months ago, but it really feels like yesterday, especially because we've been working for so many years, looking towards it as a future moment. So I feel like it's requiring quite a significant shift in our thinking and our strategizing to look ahead now with the UNGASS moment behind us, given that for so long it was ahead of us. So we're conducting the analysis now on what was said, what happened, the outcome documents, the debates in New York, and working to refine our strategy going forward. And I'm actually very grateful for this opportunity to share some of that reflection here with you today. I think in addition, I think it's important as we look forward towards the future that we note the opportunities created by the UNGASS, as well as obviously the ongoing gaps and the challenges in drug policy making that the UNGASS has highlighted. So I will say that when the UNGASS was first announced, there was genuinely high hopes for this moment. At the time, there were 3 Latin American governments, Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia, who specifically called for the UNGASS moment to be brought forward. There would have been a big drug policy moment at the UN, and there still will be in 2019, which is when the current political declaration and action plan on drugs ends. It's a 10-year action plan from 2009 to 2019. But these governments, these presidents of those 3 countries requested that this moment be brought forward 3 years to 2016. And I'm just going to show you some quotes of what the Colombian delegate said at the General Assembly in 2012 when the UNGASS was called for and adopted at the General Assembly to be brought forward. So he said, "Revising the approach on drugs maintained so far by the international community can no longer be postponed, and that the UN needed to exercise leadership to conduct an in-depth review analyzing all available options, including regulatory or market measures, in order to establish a new paradigm that would impede the flow of resources to organized crime groups." He also said an international meeting had to be convened, capable of taking the decisions necessary to increase the effectiveness of the strategies and instruments with which the global community addresses the challenges of drugs and their consequences. So looking back at this statement, I feel like we had good reason to be optimistic. And this cautious optimism was also encouraged by the fact that in the lead up to the UNGASS, we saw an increasing number of governments begin to voice their displeasure with the international drug control system and to start to question the effectiveness of repression and punishment as a means of eradicating the drug trade. At the same time that we saw this trend in more governments starting to question, we've also seen some genuine reforms of drug policies taking place on the ground. So for the moment, this has been limited largely to cannabis regulation for recreational use. And you may have spoken about it earlier today already, I'm not sure, but at the state level in the United States, where Washington and Colorado state have already moved to create regulated cannabis markets for recreational use. And I understand up to 20 more states have ballot initiatives of some description around cannabis reform for this November. So it's seemingly an irreversible trend. Also, the country of Uruguay has created a state monopoly for regulating recreational cannabis market. And now Canada, and they just announced this at the UNGASS, in fact, plans to follow suit in early 2017. So that's quite exciting. And there are also important discussions happening in other countries as diverse as Jamaica, Italy, and Mexico around liberalizing the cannabis market. A further shift in terms of the backdrop to the UNGASS has been the United States. I know that probably Dr. Hart spoke a bit about US drug policy earlier, and of course I accept that domestically there are huge challenges that remain in the US, and they are not a role model for international drug policy. But in terms of the international debate, the US position shifting slightly is really important. So for a long time, they have been the global enforcer of very repressive and punitive drug control measures. They've been at the forefront of that. They probably still are pushing that more behind the scenes, but they were really vocal about it until quite recently. And they've been increasingly taking on the language of public health within the global drug policy debates. And for example, they no longer directly oppose references to harm reduction for people who use drugs. So they always used to be one of the first countries to oppose any mention of harm reduction, and they've really backed off from that, which is important. And President Obama has also sought to address disproportionate sentences for drug offenses at the federal level. And this is also in recognition that governments, as Alex was saying earlier, cannot incarcerate their way out of this problem. So he's begun a process to commute the sentences of around 6,000 federal drug offenders. And earlier this year, a congressional task force created to examine overcrowding in the federal prison system recommended the repeal of federal mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenders. In addition to the US position, it also seems that dissent amongst the general public in a number of countries is growing louder and more vocal than before. And I'm going to highlight here a campaign that IDPC leads on, the Support Don't Punish campaign. And we've seen this campaign grow exponentially in the last 3 years. The campaign was first launched in 2013. We have a global day of action on the 26th of June, which is the UN Day Against Illicit Drug Trafficking and Drug Abuse. But we want to try and reclaim the message of that day and say this is a day when we shouldn't be, we should be reflecting on the repressive and punitive approach and actually saying that, in particular, people who use drugs should not be punished and should have access to health and harm reduction services. So the campaign started on the 26th of June 2013 with actions in 40 cities, and in 2015 more than 150 cities took part in the actions, including in Bangkok. And so next week there will be another global day of action, which I hope will be even bigger, building on the success of the last 3 years. So given the backdrop and the growing voices of dissent, as I said, there was a genuine hope that the UNGASS would not simply be a reaffirmation of the status quo. And even the UN Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, said in 2013 that he urged member states to use this opportunity to conduct a wide-ranging and open debate that considers all the options. So as civil society advocates, we saw the UNGASS really as a rare and important opportunity for member states to be honest and open about the challenges, the failures, the shortcomings of the global response to drugs. And if we really are to move towards a people-centered response, then we felt there were some serious questions that governments needed to ask of themselves. So given all of our hopes for the UNGASS, how did we do? In 2014, so after the UNGASS was announced, the IDPC network came together to agree on 5 key asks, or essentially priorities, I would say, that we would be telling governments that they should focus on or they should make happen in light of the UNGASS process. So I feel like now as we look back, the UNGASS having happened, I feel like it's appropriate to refer back to these original 5 asks. And these asks were developed in broad consultation with all of our members all over the world. So it was a very collective sort of call from civil society from diverse regions, Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, North America as well. So the first was to ensure an open and inclusive debate at the UNGASS. And by that we meant, as many member states to participate as possible, all UN agencies with a mandate that is affected by drug control policies to participate, so not simply just the agencies and the UN bodies based in Vienna, and also that civil society should be able to meaningfully participate in the process. The second one was to reset the objectives of drug policies. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute when I go through it. But it's basically saying that the metrics and indicators that we've been using to measure the success of drug control in terms of arrests and seizures, numbers of hectares eradicated, for example, is that really telling us what impact we're having on the drug market? And it's time to question those. Support policy, experimentation, and innovation. So we've talked about that, innovative policies around moving towards, even beyond decriminalization, towards looking at legal regulation, which is already happening around cannabis. And end the criminalization of the most affected populations. And within that ask, we didn't only focus on people who use drugs, but also on farmers, particularly farmers who grow drug crops for their basic subsistence needs. And finally, number 5 was to commit to the harm reduction approach. I think these 5 asks provide us with a useful framework for discussing both the opportunities and the challenges presented by the UNGASS. I also want to say that in reviewing the UNGASS outcomes, it's natural, I think, to focus on the official outcome document. It is ultimately the main outcome of the UNGASS and will go down in history as the official negotiated document from the session. However, I would argue that it is not the only tool we have to assess the progress being made and the current state of the debate. In fact, because the outcome document was agreed by consensus, it does not give us a very accurate picture of the differences expressed by member states on the issue of drug control. So in addition to this document, we should also look at many of the written contributions that member states, UN agencies, and civil society made. These are all online, on the IDPC website in particular, towards the UNGASS process. Many of these submissions were very progressive and very critical, even from some governments, of the failure and damage of punitive approaches. And equally as important is to review what was actually said in New York by governments at the special session itself. So despite the fact that they adopted the outcome document by consensus, the reality was that during the 3 days of the UNGASS, there was widespread dissent and disagreement between member states on many of the basic premises of drug control. And towards the end of my talk, I'm just going to show you a short 3.5-minute video that some colleagues have put together that highlight. You didn't have to go to the UNGASS. We've distilled it down into 3 minutes for you, so you can watch it in a second towards the end of my talk. So I'm just going to start from the 5th ask and work backwards. So commit to the harm reduction approach. Again, we saw the UNGASS, and given the rhetorical shift towards the language of public health and human rights, we saw the UNGASS as an opportunity to put those principles of public health and human rights, at the center of drug control. And one of the most critical the most critical expression of this refocusing and a clear way to operationalize this would have been explicit support for harm reduction within the UNGASS outcome document. However, as many of you are probably aware, the issue of harm reduction continues to be contentious within the UN debates, as well as at the national level in many countries, and in particular in the Southeast Asia region. But as IDPC, we called on member states to openly acknowledge that harm reduction, both as a concept and as a set of interventions, is a central and crucial component of the global drug policy response. So when I say as a concept and a set of interventions, what's happened in international drug control is that harm reduction, the words harm and reduction, have never appeared next to each other in an outcome document negotiated by consensus by the drug control body of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. But instead, they have been able to refer to interventions like needle and syringe programs, opiate substitution treatment, and referring to those interventions has become shorthand for harm reduction. But we were saying that you need to embrace harm reduction as a concept and not just a list of interventions. Also, harm reduction has, for the last 2 decades, been placed under the main theme of demand reduction, which we felt was also not appropriate, because harm reduction is not directly demand reduction. You can provide harm reduction services to people who use drugs without specifically making it necessary for them to stop using drugs. In fact, it's better that you provide harm reduction services in a non-judgmental way, and that people will then want to access those services. So that was something we hoped would happen at the UNGASS. And harm reduction is important. You know, there are very few drug policies that you can say have really worked, but by every metric set within the system, harm reduction has worked and should be acknowledged as having done so. There are not many other specific policies that can claim the same success as harm reduction for people who use drugs. And one of the best examples of this is the HIV response for people who inject drugs. Countries that have good coverage at scale of needle and syringe programs for people who inject drugs have much lower rates of HIV prevalence amongst that population group. We have the evidence that supports that. There's also a strong precedent at the General Assembly for explicit mention of the words harm reduction, given that as long ago as 2001, so 15 years ago, in the political declaration on HIV/AIDS, they agreed language that called on member states to implement and expand risk and harm reduction programs. But unfortunately for the UNGASS on drugs, even after many lengthy negotiations, it was not possible to get the words harm reduction next to each other in the UNGASS outcome document, and those words were heavily resisted by countries like Russia in particular, and many of the Arab states. But it is positive, so some of the opportunities. There was a specific mention of overdose prevention for opiate use, and there was mention of medically assisted therapy programs and also injecting equipment programs. We're not that happy with the language because it's not as good as previous language, but countries had to compromise, and this was the language that Russia pushed for on the table. However, the other thing to say is that, and you've talked a lot today about methamphetamine use, the focus on harm reduction within the international debate at the UN is still far too narrow, and the language agreed shows that governments are only still willing to address the issue of harm reduction for injecting drug use, and that's driven by the HIV/AIDS response, rather than they're not willing to talk about harm reduction for other types of drug use other than injecting, which is incredibly problematic. And that goes back to saying that you need to embrace harm reduction as a concept. So on this point, we do feel very disappointed. Although at the actual UNGASS in New York itself, at the meeting that took place, more than 30 governments made positive statements regarding harm reduction, and only 2 countries actually said that they didn't agree with harm reduction. You can probably guess which 2 countries they were, but it was China and Singapore, and they spoke out explicitly against harm reduction. The next ask was to end the criminalization of the most affected populations. And in our ask, it wasn't only about removing criminal sanctions for people who use drugs, but also a call to move away from disproportionate sentences for drug offenses in general. And as I mentioned earlier, we also called on governments to stop criminalizing subsistence farmers from growing drug-linked crops. In the outcome document, progress was made on the issue of proportionality, and some language was agreed that acknowledges the need for proportionate penalties. And this is actually a really important step forward, because until now, there has been no agreed UN language on the proportionality of sentences for drug offenses. So that's an important win. However, with respect to decriminalization for people who use drugs, the UNGASS outcome document fell very far short indeed. And it's related to the point I made earlier about, harm reduction and health outcomes. So the UNGASS was a moment to really openly acknowledge that criminalizing and punishing people from using drugs has not only failed as a deterrent, but it's also harmful, damaging, and results in serious violations of human rights. And in this region and also in this country, it continues to justify harsh measures towards people who use drugs, such as compulsory detention, arbitrary arrest, and harassment by police. So the UNGASS document should have explicitly stated that people who use drugs should not be subject to criminal punishment. And actually, going back to the member state written submissions to the UNGASS, there were many that expressed this point clearly in their written submissions. It was also highlighted in nearly all the submissions from the other UN agencies, so UNDP, the Development Programme, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, UN Women, the WHO. They all said it's time to decriminalise drug use. And also many civil society organisations also made submissions to the UNGASS that said this. And also, during the meeting of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in March, the president of the INCB made several statements to say that the UN conventions do not require the criminalization of drug use. So, and also at the national level, we talked about Portugal, but there are also many other countries that have already taken steps to decriminalize drug use and possession for personal use in order to protect the health and human rights of people who use drugs. As I said, it didn't make it into the outcome document, but at the UNGASS debate itself, there was a clear dissensus, so the opposite of consensus, dissensus on this point, with around 22 countries actually making supportive statements in favor of decriminalization, while around 10 countries spoke out against it. And on this point as well, the outcome document, a positive thing, actually does have some good language around encouraging governments to consider alternatives to conviction and punishment, in particular for low-level drug offenders, as provided for on the UN treaties on drug control. And there's also some greater attention to the gender dimension of drug policies, which is important. I think you probably heard earlier about the fact that one of the fastest growing prison populations globally in most parts of the world is women, and overwhelmingly for low-level non-violent drug offenses. So we really need to look at that question. Why is it women who are being caught up in the system? Why is it women who are committing these offenses? What is it about women's socio and economic vulnerability that makes them more susceptible to being caught up in the drug trade? And then, therefore, is it helping to punish them and incarcerate them? Is that actually, moving towards the objectives of reducing the drug trade? I will also mention here that there were strong calls to include a mention of abolishing the death penalty for drugs offenses, but this did not survive the negotiations, and there was tough resistance from retentionist states saying that this was a matter of national sovereignty. So the use of the death penalty for drugs offenses remains one of the most contentious issues within the global drug policy debate. And of course, there was no mention in the document, and very little mention in New York itself, around not punishing farmers for growing drug-related crops, even for their basic survival. So moving on to our third ask was support policy experimentation and innovation. So in this ask, we called on governments to acknowledge the lack of progress that has been achieved by current drug policies, despite the huge collateral damage caused by such policies. And also to acknowledge that we are no closer to achieving the goals. So I mentioned the 2009 political declaration. So the goals set out in the political declaration and action plan, which is to significantly reduce or eliminate the global drug market by 2019. So we've got another 3 years to reach that goal. But we wanted some acknowledgement at the UNGASS that we really are no closer, and that actually we should step away from these unrealistic and damaging goals. And also because, in terms of the innovation part, we propose that governments use the UNGASS moment to create the space for experimentation with new policy approaches that could better respond to the shifting realities on the ground. However, the UNGASS really demonstrated that there is no appetite to talk about innovative policies. Despite the reforms that we're seeing around cannabis that's happening in certain countries, it proved impossible to discuss these developments in any meaningful way as part of the UNGASS negotiations. And I think it, really illustrates the very serious disconnect between reality and the policy debate that makes the international policy debate, and the UNGASS in particular, so disappointing. And the tensions that cannabis regulation causes with the international drug control treaties was also completely ignored. So we feel that despite the limitations that the treaties impose towards legally regulated markets, we feel that legal regulation for recreational use is outside of the provisions of the international drug control treaties. But despite this, governments should be honest about the fact that it's outside of this and try to explore these options while at the same time being honest about the tension it creates with the international drug control system. And again, at the UNGASS, to talk about the countries that were sort of for and against in their actual country statements, more than 15 countries stated that they could not accept legal regulation, while about 9 countries said that they supported this kind of policy shift. And the fourth ask was to reset the objectives of drug policies. So under this ask, we called for the UNGASS to move away from the unrealistic and damaging goal of a drug-free world and to set new metrics and indicators to measure how drug control policies contribute to the broader objectives of the UN that I mentioned before: human rights, public health, development, peace, and human security. Unfortunately, the UNGASS reaffirms the commitment to achieve a society free of drug abuse. We have talked about whether that's better than a drug-free world or not. I think, it's not necessarily, maybe it's slightly better, but I'm not sure that it's a real win. And the calls for better indicators, there was some language calling for better indicators, but that didn't survive the negotiation process for the final document. However, on a really positive note, the UNGASS outcome document breaks out of the traditional 3 pillars of international drug control. So for the last 20 years, international drug control has been organized into demand reduction, supply reduction, and international cooperation. And we felt that these 3 pillars were far too narrow. So it was very positive, in fact, that the outcome document broke out of this 3-pillar approach, includes a specific pillar on ensuring access to essential medicines, includes a specific pillar around addressing the human rights dimension of drug policy. So, and this shift will be quite important as we move forward towards 2019, and also as we move towards developing more meaningful indicators for looking at the impact of drug policies. And in terms of the indicators question, because of the traditional emphasis that's quite narrow on reducing supply and reducing demand, the metrics have been very narrowly focused on arrests and prosecutions of drug dealers, of traffickers, and in many cases of drug users, of seizures of drugs, so how many kilos of heroin, how many methamphetamine pills, and hectares, the number of hectares of drug crops eradicated, so how many opium fields or coca fields did we manage to eradicate? And also increasingly for methamphetamine, how many drug processing labs have we destroyed? But these are not sophisticated metrics, and they are too simplistic to be meaningful in the context of an increasingly complex and resilient drug market. So the shift out of the narrow focus on demand and supply is an opportunity for introducing better metrics and indicators. I mentioned already the win on access to essential medicines, which will need to be strongly operationalized. And so our final ask, which was our first ask, in fact, to ensure an open and inclusive debate. I think that on this point, we think the UNGASS really failed to live up to this commitment. On the positive side, I mentioned the many progressive submissions that were made. And we actually, as IDPC, we actually pulled out some of the most progressive language from all of those submissions into a shadow outcome document, which you'll find on our website. And many of these submissions were really honest and frank about the urgent need to change drug policy and to move away from repressive approaches. But again, these documents, these submissions were not adequately considered in the process of negotiating the outcome document and had little, if any, impact on the debate. The negotiations were not transparent or inclusive. They were led from Vienna almost exclusively. And there are 70 governments that do not have permanent representation in Vienna. So they have no embassy in Vienna. They don't have anyone there to represent them in the negotiations. That's a third of the UN. We're not there to negotiate this document. And there was very little attempt to find a way to include those countries, and particularly countries from the global south who don't have a lot of resource, to be somewhat included in the process. And in the last 6 months of negotiations, most of the negotiation meetings took place in closed settings that even civil society were not allowed to observe. So it was very non-transparent. And as a result, as civil society, we feel that the process for the UNGASS was really biased towards adherence to the status quo and a deliberate shutting down or stifling of the dissenting voices that would call for reform. And at the UNGASS itself in New York, civil society participation was very problematic. Many of my colleagues from civil society traveled for thousands of miles to come to New York. They were told that they would be able to access the debate and the building, but they were not, at the last minute, when they arrived in New York, they had problems getting into the building. They didn't have the right passes, and it was hugely problematic and very disappointing for many of them, especially after UN security changed the rules at the last minute. So these kind of issues for civil society access make the rhetoric around the meaningful participation of civil society seem very hollow. So as a result of we see as a result of the lack of inclusivity, transparency, and honesty in the UNGASS process, the outcome document is not a realistic or forward-looking reflection of the current drug policy environment. And I feel like I've painted quite a negative picture, probably because I've focused a bit on the outcome document. But I want to say that the overall feeling after the UNGASS for IDPC and for many of our civil society partners looking forward continues to be one of cautious optimism. And I say that because of the widespread dissent and disagreement that we who were in New York witnessed between the governments who attended the special session. They can no longer pretend that there is a global consensus on drug control, and Alex alluded to this earlier. And at the UNGASS, it was very, very clear that that is over. Of course, we do need to worry about the fact that some of the hardline countries are becoming stronger in their resolve to maintain the status quo, and they remain committed to punitive and repressive approaches, despite their lack of effectiveness. But I think this can also be seen as a reaction to the shifting policy landscape. They are putting up a strong defense because the old, outdated approaches are seriously now under attack. And the broken consensus creates an opportunity for discussion and debate as we look forwards towards 2019. And the other thing we keep saying to our government colleagues is that if governments care about international cooperation on drugs, they need to be honest about what's happening, about the successes and the failures, about the broken consensus, and they need to be open to change and modernization. Otherwise, the whole principle and the concept of international cooperation on drugs will become obsolete. So before I conclude, I'm going to show this video, which is 3.5 minutes, and then I'll give you my concluding remarks.
Some countries are legalizing cannabis production, while others are executing people for using or selling cannabis. How can the UN pretend there is a consensus on how to tackle the drug problem?
It's a broad consensus. It's a broad consensus. No,
It certainly is.
It is 2016, and it is time to recognize
risk and harm reduction measures to protect our societies.
We have therefore not seen the need to go down the route of harm reduction.
Harm reduction, the success is obvious.
We are concerned over such a behavior in practice, and we are against it.
it's a broad consensus.
Syringe service programs have been proven effective at saving lives.
We are making naloxone antidote kits available to save lives from overdoses.
I have
the honor to take the floor on behalf of the European Union and its member states and the following countries: Andorra, Argentina, Australia.
We would like to put on record the following delegation principal positions: China, Indonesia,
Bosnia and Herzegovina, Canada,
Singapore, Malaysia,
Iceland,
Pakistan,
Liechtenstein, Mexico,
Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates,
Monaco,
Oman,
Montenegro,
Bahrain,
Namibia,
Brunei Darussalam,
New Zealand,
Iran,
Norway,
Egypt,
Uruguay, and Uzbekistan.
The death penalty is an important component of our system of justice.
We have a strong, unequivocal opposition to the death penalty.
There is no international consensus on the abolition of the death penalty. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Decriminalizing the use of drugs is a retreat.
The United Kingdom delivers proportionality in criminal justice while retaining a criminal offence for drug possession.
We also introduced the decriminalization of drug possession.
We have decriminalized the consumption. The Republic of Ecuador decriminalizes the use and consumption.
Actually, I am the first chair of this committee to openly support decriminalization.
We remain firm and resolute in our opposition to all calls to legalize controlled drugs.
Any form of legalization of narcotics should be resolutely opposed.
No coherent public health policy can include making yet more substances even more available.
Responsible regulation is the key to reducing drug-related harm.
Uruguay has strategic thinking on the need to regulate all markets.
We must move beyond prohibition to effective prevention and effective regulation. Thousands of lives depend on this.
Muchas gracias a mi amigo Yuri Fedotov.
Support, don't punish. Thank you very much.
Yes, so you didn't have to go. There you have it. That's basically what happened. For 3 days, we watched governments literally on all the key issues just disagree with each other, one after another, and on more issues than you saw there, you know, also on whether the war on drugs has failed or not, whether we should still be pushing for a drug-free society. And, you know, I have to say for us advocates, that's really important. That disagreement, that dissensus creates now the tension to be able to move forward. Because if we look back to 1998, which was the last UNGASS, where the slogan was a drug-free world, we can do it. I think another important point to make is in 1998, the then head of the UNODC and the Secretary General of the UN at that time, who was Kofi Annan, both said in their statements that we needed to strive for a drug-free world. In 2016, not a single UN official of any level in any of their speeches at the UNGASS or in the lead up to the UNGASS said anything about trying to achieve a society free of drug abuse. And that's also an important shift because it's no longer seen as credible or acceptable to be pushing for such an unrealistic and damaging goal. So my final thoughts, I think I already said these basically, but yeah, so what happens now in terms of, you know, will there be a new consensus? Some of the greatest minds on this issue, strategic thinkers on drug policy, are now saying that, you know, we're unlikely to have a new consensus. What we will continue to see is this more fracturing of the system or contentious pluralism as countries may increasingly go their different ways. And that's worrying because some countries could become more repressive in their approaches as some countries liberalize. But that's quite a likely trend. That was just the poster from '98 I wanted to show you. And I just wanted to mention briefly, which I didn't mention in my speech, was obviously the strong link to the Sustainable Development Goals, which I presented on in December at the Kamlangjai event. But to say that also the Sustainable Development Goals do create an opportunity and are an important hook for also trying to modernize the drug control regime, and to say that if we continue to implement drug control in the way that we're currently doing it, we're not going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the important link between the two. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, and may I speak in Thai?
You may. I will listen just in case I don't
Okay.
fully understand everything, but please do.
Thank you. ขออนุญาตถามเป็นภาษาไทยนะครับเพราะว่าภาษาอังกฤษไม่แข็งแรงฟังจากคุณแอนแล้วได้อารมณ์ที่ได้อารมณ์เพราะว่าผมเป็นคนหนึ่งที่ไปร่วมในการประชุม UNGASS 2016เนี่ยจะเห็นเวทีระหว่างประเทศซึ่งดูแล้วเราก็มีความหวังว่าในเวทีของสหประชาชาติเนี่ยน่าจะเป็นเวทีที่เราจะได้อะไรมาเป็นประโยชน์แต่พอดูแล้วมาตรงกับที่ดร.อเล็กซ์กับโปรเฟสเซอร์คาร์ฮาร์ทที่บอกว่าอย่าไปเอาของใครมาดูของเราเองเป็นที่พึ่งของเราเองดีกว่าเพราะว่าดูแล้วนะครับผมว่าจริงๆแล้วเนี่ยปัญหาแต่ละประเทศไม่เหมือนกันสิ่งที่ผมอยากจะพูดเนี่ยก็คือตอนนี้ประเทศไทยเราก็มีท่าทีในการเปลี่ยนแปลงนโยบายเปลี่ยนแปลงมาตรการทางกฎหมายเรากำลังร่างประมวลกฎหมายยาเสพติดซึ่งที่ทราบเมื่อเช้าก็คืออยู่ในขั้นตอนของการพิจารณาของคณะกรรมการกฤษฎีกาหลายๆอย่างเท่าที่ทราบก็มีแนวโน้มไปทางด้านบวกค่อนข้างมากนะครับผมคิดว่าปัญหายาเสพติดเนี่ยส่วนหนึ่งที่เราได้เรียนรู้มาจากเวทีการประชุมของ UNGASS 2016เนี่ยน่าจะมีประโยชน์ในการที่จะกลับมาเสริมหรือมาเพิ่มเติมบางประเด็นในตัวร่างกฎหมายทั้งนี้ก็เพราะว่าบางเรื่องเนี่ยเราคิดไว้ก่อนแต่พอเราไปเห็นแนวทางปฏิบัติของต่างประเทศแล้วคิดว่าอาจจะมีบางเรื่องที่จะแก้ไขแล้วทำให้สมบูรณ์ได้มากขึ้นประเด็นอย่างหนึ่งที่ผมคิดแล้วคิดอีกว่าเรากำลังกำหนดนโยบายกำลังจะปรับปรุงแก้ไขกฎหมายปัญหาเนี่ยมันเป็นปัญหาของใครกันแน่ปัญหายาเสพติดมีหลายหน่วยงานมากที่เป็นหน่วยงานที่รับผิดชอบแต่ดูแล้วผมคิดว่าคนที่เกี่ยวข้องก็คือทางภาคประชาชนก็เลยอยากจะถามทางคุณแอนว่าจริงๆแล้วเนี่ยภาคประชาสังคมหรือ Civil Society น่าจะมีส่วนเข้ามาเกี่ยวข้องกับเรื่องของการกำหนดนโยบายแล้วรวมถึงเรื่องของการปรับปรุงแก้ไขกฎหมายมากน้อยแค่ไหนอันนี้อาจจะตอบจากประสบการณ์ก็ได้ว่าจริงๆแล้วเนี่ยรัฐบาลเป็นเจ้าของปัญหาจะออกแบบจะดีไซน์อะไรให้เหมือนกับที่ตัวเองต้องการอย่างนั้นมันจะประสบความสำเร็จไหมหรือคิดว่าภาคประชาสังคมบังเอิญที่นั่งอยู่นี่มีทางคุณน้อยคุณวีรพันธ์เนี่ยทำงานอยู่ภาคประชาสังคมอยู่ด้วยก็คิดว่าเขาก็พยายามเหมือนกันนะว่าปัญหาหลายๆเรื่องเนี่ยที่เขาเป็นคนสัมผัสโดยตรงเนี่ยอยากจะเข้ามามีส่วนร่วมก็อยากจะเรียนถามประเด็นแรกว่าภาคประชาสังคมควรจะเข้ามามีบทบาทในการกำหนดนโยบายแล้วก็มีส่วนร่วมในการปรับปรุงแก้ไขกฎหมายมากน้อยขนาดไหนและในขั้นตอนใดอันนี้คำถามที่หนึ่งนะครับส่วนคำถามที่สองเป็นเรื่องที่คิดว่าเราเองก็กำลังประสบปัญหาอยู่มากเช่นกันคือเรื่องของการลดทอนการเป็นความผิดทางอาญาหรือ decriminalization ตรงเนี้ยถ้าดูจากกฎหมายยาเสพติดแล้วเราก็จะเห็นว่ากฎหมายที่เดิมๆเนี่ยก็จะเน้นว่าความผิดเกี่ยวกับยาเสพติดเป็นความผิดทางอาญามีโทษจำคุกมีโทษปรับไล่ตั้งแต่เสพขึ้นไปเรียกว่าเดินเฉี่ยวหน่อยนึงก็อาจจะเป็นความผิดแล้วล่ะแต่ยังไม่มีหลักฐานเป็นแต่เพียงว่า ตั้งแต่คนเสพขึ้นไปเนี่ยมีความผิดทั้งหมดตรงเนี้ยเราก็บอกว่าความจริงแล้วประเทศไทยเนี่ยนะครับปัญหายาเสพติดที่รุนแรงมากที่สุดก็คือปัญหาเรื่องยาบ้าหรือเมทแอมเฟตามีนคนที่ทำผิดเปอร์เซ็นต์มากที่สุดประมาณสัก 70-80% เนี่ยคือคนที่เป็นผู้ใช้ผู้เสพผู้ค้านี่มีเปอร์เซ็นต์ไม่มากเพราะเท่าที่ผมรวบรวมดูแล้วเนี่ยจากสถิตินะครับผู้เสพกับผู้ครอบครองในปริมาณเล็กน้อยเนี่ยมีอยู่ประมาณสัก 70-80% กลุ่มเหล่านี้แหละที่จะต้องไปเผชิญกับมาตรการทางกฎหมายที่มีโทษทั้งจำคุกแล้วก็มีโทษปรับอยู่ด้วยทีนี้พอมาพูดถึงเรื่องของมาตรการ decriminalization เนี่ยผมดูแล้วคิดว่ามาตรการนี้เป็นมาตรการที่น่าจะสนใจแล้วก็อีกอย่างหนึ่งว่าการ decriminalization เนี่ยในกระบวนการที่ต่างประเทศทำส่วนใหญ่แล้วเนี่ยเขาไปลดทอนการเป็นความผิดอาญาที่ศาลเพื่อที่จะให้ผู้พิพากษาเป็นผู้พิจารณาว่าอันเนี้ยสมควรลดทอนแหละหรือตั้งแต่ในกระบวนการตั้งแต่ชั้นจับกลุ่มหรือในชั้นของตำรวจหรือในชั้นอัยการเพราะหากว่าจะรอศาลเนี่ยผมคิดว่ากระบวนการมันยืดยาวแล้วคนเหล่านี้ก็จะถูกประทุษร้ายพูดง่ายๆปัจจุบันนี้ผมอยู่ที่สำนักงานคณะกรรมการป้องกันและปราบปรามการทุจริตจะเห็นว่าคนที่มีข้อหาเสพเนี่ยจะถูกเจ้าหน้าที่ปฏิบัติโดยมิชอบคือพูดง่ายๆไปใช้อำนาจหน้าที่แสวงหาผลประโยชน์โดยมิชอบเยอะมากจะเป็นไปได้ไหมว่าขั้นตอนในการกำหนดให้เป็น decriminalization เนี่ยมันน่าจะมีตั้งแต่ต้นๆก่อนที่จะมาถึงในชั้นของอัยการหรือในชั้นของผู้พิพากษาซึ่งตรงนี้ในหลักการเนี่ยก็เห็นด้วยเป็นแต่เพียงว่าดูเหมือนกับว่ามันจะใช้เวลานานเกินไปแล้วกระบวนการเหล่านี้ว่าที่จริงแล้วมันไปกระทบต่อผู้คนค่อนข้างมากไม่ว่าจะเป็นพวกนักเรียนนักศึกษาหรือว่าผู้ที่ประกอบอาชีพซึ่งเขาจะได้รับความเดือดร้อนครับแค่2คำถามนี้ครับขอบคุณครับ
On the question of civil society involvement, from our perspective, and when we're working with governments all over the world to develop or shift direction in drug policy, we always advocate and we see it as fundamentally important that the people most affected by those policies, and it should be in all areas of policy making, not just drug policy, are consulted and involved in the process. I've heard Kun Veerapan speak very eloquently on this issue many times, but, people who use drugs are the ones who know. They know what works for them. They know, if a policy is developed, whether it's going to create more problems, if it's going to make the situation worse. They're living it every single day. So I think that any process of policy development needs to ensure not just a ticking box exercise, but a real and meaningful consultation with the communities and the representative of those communities who are most directly affected. If you want the policy to work, if you want the policy to be effective, I think that's fundamentally important. And I think it's fundamentally important for Thailand. I'm sure that Kun Veerapan can say a bit more about that in his response also. But we're really on the same page with that. And I think they have to be consulted. Who are you doing it for? Yes, it's a government problem, but ultimately, you're seeing these people as the problem. They're not the problem. They're actually part of your solution, and they should be involved in the discussion as meaningfully as possible. And I think if you look to the Portuguese model, which has always been lauded as one of the most successful models of decriminalization, you will see that there was a lot of public consultation, and particularly consultation with drug users on how to develop the most effective means of implementing decriminalization in Portugal. On your second question, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. But let me just say this around decriminalization. you know, from IDPC's perspective, we've been studying different models of decriminalization all over the world. And there are many different models. And there are different models that decide, you know, who is ultimately responsible for making the decision about whether this person should be subject to a criminal offense or not. You know, I can direct you to those materials, but what we advocate, what we're increasingly advocating for is what we call the gold standard of decriminalization, which would be full decriminalization with no sanction, administrative or otherwise. So what it would mean in practice is a police officer comes across someone who happens to be smoking some gancha, marijuana, and the police officer, there might be some other provisions. If that person is smoking that gancha cigarette outside the gates of a school, okay, you might have some rules around, you know, because that is too close to a school, for example. But if he's generally in the street smoking a gancha cigarette, the police officer would have only the power to confiscate. So instead of then this person suffering any further, because they're just for their personal use, they only have one joint, the police officer would confiscate this, send them on their way, in theory. Because the concerns that you're worrying about, like exploitation, corruption in the system, that for these individuals then bearing the brunt further down the line as they get caught up in the criminal justice system and then they're bribed or abused, etc., that would eliminate, you know, all of that in terms of, and the police would have no, because police abuse is also a very serious concern, right? The police would have no other business with this person other than confiscation. That's the gold standard of decriminalization. That I think there are very few countries where that's actually implemented. I think Portugal doesn't actually do that. Spain is one, and Uruguay is another where they never criminalize drug use in the first place, but they still have the powers of confiscation should they choose to do that. So I know that Thailand is a long way off from that discussion, but you've got to think about the reasons why you want to decriminalize in the first place, and if it's to reduce the instance of such people, vulnerable people, being therefore abused or exploited by the system further on, then you've got to think about the process and how that process works to protect those people from exploitation as they move through the criminal justice system or not. And what's the most effective and cost-effective means of decriminalization? Because for me in Thailand, or in many countries, it indeed seems very complicated. You arrest someone, then you've got to decide whether they're a user, whether they're a dealer, how many drugs they have on them. You've got to send them here, send them there. And it's not really creating efficiencies in the criminal justice process. So I would urge you to look back at the main reasons for removing criminal sanctions in the first place and what you want to achieve. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Director Ann. I'm impressed for your great presentation. And due to we have the limitation of time, so I will go straight to my question. As we know now, Thailand facing with many problems about human rights, such as human trafficking, or extrajudicial killing, and so on. And it seems to me that UNGASS can make some impact to Thai's government. So, at present you are working in IDPC, working with people, international people, and you are as a part of Thai people. So my question is, what should be the first priority for Thai government to do concerning drug policy? Could you please suggest any good directions?
Thank you. It's a very good question. Well, I think it goes back to the question from Kun Kop Kun. I do think that, you know, in Thailand, the levels of incarceration are incredibly high. I think I read something statistic this week that Thai prison capacity is something like 139%. That's incredibly high. And also that, you know, I've known this for a long time, that in terms of the numbers in prison, around 70+% are for low-level, non-violent drug offences. So that seems to me to be a priority for the Thai government to address that. And also, I think I said this in my speech in December, there is a trend internationally to look at the levels of incarceration and the fact that in many parts of the world, prison populations, overcrowding, etc., is being driven by a disproportionate response to drug control. And to look, as Kun Gopgun said, who is it that is in Thai prisons? You are not, I don't think you are by and large imprisoning the people that you really want to imprison or punish, which would be, like high-level traffickers who are actually benefiting from the drug trade. You are imprisoning low-level offenders who are poor and vulnerable and marginalized already, and they're easier to catch, and they're involved in the drug trade out of some sort of usually economic necessity. And so you need to look at, in each individual case, the aggravating and mitigating factors as to why someone has been involved in the drug trade, including the question of women, which we mentioned, because we know that in Thailand that's also a very big issue, that the numbers of women are growing. So I think that would be, for me, a priority for Thailand, but then not to say that decriminalization is not a priority, and also really embracing and accepting that harm reduction needs to be a central part of the government response for people who use drugs in Thailand, and whether that's for injecting drug use or for methamphetamine use, and also understanding, I think this is the point that Dr. Hart, that Carl was making earlier, that, going back to the question of 10% and the 90%. 90% of people who use drugs, and this is data from the UNODC that's been repeated many times, and it's very clear, who use drugs don't have any other associated problems with their drug use. And the 10%, drug use might be one of the problems that they have, but usually there are many other factors that relate to their vulnerability, if they get into serious problems with their drug use, whether that's unemployment, homelessness, some other economic vulnerability. So the focus on drug use is always a little bit, it's too easy, actually. The people who really have problems, and it's a very small percentage, there are many other areas in terms of social policy that needs to look at how to support such people. But most people use drugs without any problems at all, and they use recreationally, they use sometimes, it's a bit like alcohol. Some people really have a big problem with alcohol and they have issues with their alcohol use. The majority of people drink sometimes, drink a little, drink a lot, don't drink at all. It's a bit the same, really. So I think the idea that you have to treat everybody and that everybody needs to be put into treatment, that is overwhelming, and completely unnecessary and a waste of resources.
ชื่ออะไรคะสวัสดีครับคุณแอนดีใจที่เจออีกทีนะครับ First, many thanks for a clear presentation. For me, it's two things. The first thing, thank you, P. Gopgun, for this question. I just want to reflect a bit on that. And the second thing is one question for you, Kun Ann. Now we're looking for the effective drug policy for drug user and the community. One word from my friend, drug users, he said, nothing for us without us. So that means if you don't involve drug user and community from the beginning, it's nothing through them from the policy. So I think we need to involve drug user representative and civil society and community since from the beginning with respectful, meaningful, and equally. So I think these three key things is very important on the process to involve drug user and civil society in the policy reform process. My question is, คุณแอนในฐานะที่มีประสบการณ์ทำงานเรื่องการขับเคลื่อนนโยบายและกฎหมายยาเสพติดในระดับนานาชาติมาหลายปีครับหลังจากการประชุมอังกัสเมื่อเดือนเมษายนที่ผ่านมาคุณแอนคิดว่านโยบายยาเสพติดหรือกฎหมายยาเสพติดในแต่ละประเทศทั่วโลกเนี่ยจะเกิดการเปลี่ยนแปลงไหมถ้าไม่เปลี่ยนแปลง นั่นหมายความว่าพวกเขามีหลักฐานสนับสนุนเพียงพอว่าให้ทำวิธีการเดิมๆต่อไปหรือถ้าเปลี่ยนแปลงแสดงว่าเรามีหลักฐานข้อมูลสนับสนุนที่เพียงพอที่จะเกิดการเปลี่ยนแปลงเรื่องพวกนี้ไหมครับขอบคุณครับ
ขอบคุณค่ะคุณวีรพันธ์ That's like the $1 million question, right? Thank you for your question. It's a good question. You know, so the UNGASS outcome document is not legally binding, right? It's a negotiated political document. So it points to the positive things I pointed about, you know, proportionality of sentences, alternatives to incarceration, the gender dimension, access to medicines. I mean, these all put pressure on governments and can be used by advocates, civil society advocates, to say, look, you negotiated this document at the UN, you signed it, because they all signed it, so you need to shift in these directions. But I will say in terms of national legislation, the way that, you know, policy works, particularly drug control, is that, and this is something we've actually learned and are reflecting on after the UNGASS, is the change happens bottom up. So it's countries that lead the way. And then that change gets reflected at the international level, and it's a bit like a cycle. So some countries lead the way. We saw that with harm reduction, for example, the harm reduction response, yeah? That, you know, countries I mean, Alex talked a bit about this. Countries like the UK, like Australia, they led the way for implementing harm reduction responses in the 80s. When they did that, they were heavily criticized at the international level by countries that opposed harm reduction. But nevertheless, they kept doing it. They showed results. They kept pushing for it. And then they kept coming back to the international level and talking about it and advocating for it. And for other countries to hear. And then other countries slowly, and it's still happening very slowly, then start to adopt such practices. So that's sort of how it works. And I'm telling you that because I don't think that there should be this expectation that as a result of the UNGASS, things will then start to change in specific countries. I think that the countries where things are changing, there was already momentum. The UNGASS helped to create some momentum, but there was already momentum being created. But yeah, I think that it was important. The UNGASS process was important in terms of driving the discussion towards more progressive responses. And you know, we will see, for example, Canada. I can give you a very specific example of Canada. I don't think it's because of the UNGASS. I think it's because many other countries had already started to pave the way for cannabis regulation. That now Canada, with their new president, is planning to do that. So I think we can use the UNGASS outcome document, we can use the discussion that was had in the debate to continue to put pressure on governments where we want them to change and reform their drug policies towards more progressive approaches. I think that in this region, it's challenging. It is really challenging. I mean, one positive thing we saw was that Thailand did not, you saw in the film I showed, Thailand did not sign the Indonesia statement against the abolition of the death penalty. And Thailand has actually been abstaining from signing those statements for the last couple of years at the UN, which I guess is positive. But I think Thailand as a country could definitely be more progressive at the UN level than they currently are. They're very progressive on alternative development in particular and the rights of subsistence farmers, but that's sort of where it ends. And I think that, yeah, it would be good to see some shift there. But many countries in this region, when I was talking about the countries that are quite entrenched in their repressive positions and are digging their heels in, that's many Southeast Asian countries that are doing that. So, you know, that will be the challenge for us, particularly working in this region. How do we work with these governments to continue pushing for harm reduction, for progress, for not punishing drug users, low-level offenders, and and some of the arguments around prison overcrowding and incarceration and cost effectiveness might be relevant as we try to have those conversations here in Southeast Asia.
Thank you for the question and answers from Kun Ann.